Everything we cared about last year, everything we funded in the 23 budget, we care about again this year, and we fund again this year in the budget. So this is not the plot twist budget. You know, there's not a lot of surprises in here. We think that's a feature, not a bug in this budget, and that is something that I've been talking to the committees about here. That there's not a lot of new things in here. There is a new thing in here, a new priority in here, and we will talk about that today, and that is munitions. Ukraine has certainly informed the lack of flexibility in our industrial base and in this front in particular, that we need to be up our game and be a little more agile and do better. So I will talk about what we are doing on that front. That is probably the biggest new thing, but even that is not completely new, because we have been talking about that, especially with the committees, for at least 6 months. So that is not completely surprising, but it is an emphasis point. Third thing is, I think you may know, despite what I just said, that we are pushing on munitions in a way that's informed by what's been happening in Ukraine. Ukraine is not in this budget. This is not a Ukraine budget. This is an NDS budget. The situation in Ukraine is still far too fluid for us to be programming into it what we think we will be doing starting 6 months from now and going a year beyond that. So we will continue to handle that the way that this country has handled emergent operations for 50 years, which is to start with supplementals. If it turns out that it persists in ways that become predictable, we can always talk about moving it into the budget later. So other than the baseline small $300 million that we have had in the budget for years for Ukraine, nothing else has moved in. So there's a sort of a disconnect between, discontinuity from 23, where there's supplementals in place, to 24, where we're not projecting those yet. Does not in any way does not imply that we care less. The president's been clear that we're in this with the Ukrainians for as long as it takes. So that's not the message of this budget. It's just not budget. There's not budget quality information for me to work with at this time. Fourth thing that I want to say up front that is also not new and different, I believe I said it last year, but if not, this budget is focused on getting ourselves more capable, getting better, not bigger. We are not trying to grow the force here. We're not trying to grow the force structure here. We're trying to add capability at the higher end. That is really the emphasis of this budget. That and readiness are the top two things, whereas growing the size of the force, which is the third leg of the triangle of what determines the structure of your budget and the size of your budget, the force part is relatively constant. It's the readiness and the capability that really are the drivers here, and capability number one. So on my next slide, which has, I should have a top line type photo or chart on it, the next one after that. Yeah, there we go. So this is the top line numbers. Hopefully you may have already seen this. Our materials, by the way, including the longer version that I'm able to use today of this, is on our website, my website, for the Comptroller, along with all of the line items and a number of other documents, and more will be coming. So this year's request is $842 billion for DoD. I don't focus so much myself, although some of the committees do, on the national defense number that includes the warhead budget at NNSA, but that's on this chart as well. That is $26 billion higher than last year's congressional enacted level, and that level, as you recall, was added $43 billion to what we requested. So it is what some might consider a modest 3.2% increase over what Congress enacted last year. It's more like 9% more than we asked for last year. And as you can see on this chart, it's $100 billion more than we got from Congress just 2 years ago in FY22. This top line is about, as I said, 3.2% more in just regular nominal terms than last year. It is, however, inflation is assumed here at a fairly modest rate. The inflation numbers, I wish I got to pick them myself. I don't. They are handed to us by OMB. We use the same thing other agencies use. The impact on us is, the impact is not the same across every agency. We buy a lot more capital investment than anybody else, so it doesn't affect everybody equally, but we don't get to make up our own numbers. So the inflation anticipated for 24 compared to the year that we're halfway through now, 2.4% increase, which I know may sound modest. That is less than what we're experiencing today, certainly less than what we experienced last year. It will take a year and a half before we know if that was correct or not by the time the numbers are in for what happened in FY24. CBO, for comparison, the Congressional Budget Office, where I started my career, by the way, does their own estimate for Congress, and they just came out with theirs. Theirs is 2.7. So we may well be both correct in the same neighborhood or both incorrect in the same neighborhood. We're not very far apart from each other. The difference between OMB's estimate and theirs would not drive a particularly significant change in our top line if you were to use that. So very rough math, 3.2% just basic increase in the top line. 2.4% inflation means the real growth is only 0.8, 3.2 minus 2.4. So that's, you know, it rounds to 1, but it's not a particularly large number. That being said, we've had considerable real growth in the last 2 years. So mathematicians know that, you know, you don't have to have 3% a year. If you can get 8 or 9% in 1 year and then 1% the next year, you're even better off, actually. So we're in a good place. The Secretary's happy with this top line. Doesn't mean there's 100% of what we tried to get in here, but we got our top priorities in here. We prioritize carefully in program budget review. That's the whole point of it. And so what we got over to and approved by the White House had very few changes from what we were trying to do. So while we didn't get every single thing that we could think of in here, we got our highest priorities in here, and so we're happy with this. On the next chart, I just want to sketch out kind of across the 5-year level. In this pictorial graph, you'll see the blue line at the bottom is this administration's first budget, the FY22 Biden budget for defense. The next line up in the middle in the green is last year's plan that we proposed, and then on top, of course, is this year's in red. A couple points here. So obviously you can see Congress has done some increases, especially last year, which is why the red line is higher than the green line in 23. But what I really want to focus on is starting with this request in 24 going out, and I realize that from where you're sitting, this may be hard to read, but the difference in 24 through 28, so the FITUP that we have just completed and will be sending to Congress, is $300 billion more resources over that 5-year period that the President has approved for us compared to his own plan to our request, which he approved last year. So, and then if you compare the red line down to the blue line in 2 years, we've moved $100 billion per year. I mentioned the $100 billion a minute ago with respect to 24 compared to 22, but that's also true. You can kind of see the lines have similar slope, the red and the blue ones do. So that difference of 100 a year is constant. So to me, yes, some of that goes to inflation, but there's also real progress in here, really moving the needle on investing in our own strategy to make it real. It takes, and I would be the first to admit, and I think I did admit the other day, that budgets alone don't, you know, a budget's an input. Budgets don't deter China. Budgets don't produce outcomes, but that's where it starts. So if you want capability, if you want readiness, you have to buy it. So it starts with getting it in the budget, starts with getting the right mix in the budget. Then you have to get it, obviously, through the White House, through Congress, get it enacted, get that same choices, or basically the same set of choices approved, get it on contract, get it delivered, then it becomes real, but it doesn't become real without a budget. So in defense of what we in the financial world do, we do think that we have a pretty big impact on policy and making policy implementation real by getting things funded. So that's, we are happy with the resources that we have to try and get there faster. So that's what we think that we're doing. The flip side of getting there faster is what we have experienced, unfortunately, the last 13 years is averaging about 4 months late for enactment of our budget. So that is something that we saw was a feature, became a staple of the Budget Control Act era that we're out of, and I hope not to go back into. A little bit beyond my control, a lot beyond my control, right? A lot beyond the Secretary's control. This debt ceiling debate that's coming is not about us. We understand that. We will be impacted by it. But one of the things that we saw, again, was the CR, the tolerance for CRs, the expectation that you start at 10 weeks and then you go from there, as really impedes our progress. It's hard to compete with China effectively as we might if we have our hands tied behind our back a couple months every year and have seen a 12-month fiscal year sort of collapse to 8 or 9 months on the operating side. Doesn't mean you still can't get your acquisition programs on contract, but the delays are harmful to us, and I do want to mention that's sort of on a downside. The chart is a chart, right? That's how much money there is, but when you get it, it makes a difference to us as well. On the next chart, let me just mention a couple things, and I'm not going to go through this in any detail. In fact, this is a amalgamation of 5 or 6 different charts that we used when we rolled out the budget to speak about integrated deterrence, the heart of our strategy in terms of air power, land power, sea power, nuclear deterrence, missile defense, space, cyber. I've kind of mushed these all together on this one slide because I want to leave half the time here for questions. We have pretty robust investments in all of these. We have the largest procurement request ever in nominal terms, and we have the largest R&D request ever, again in nominal terms. That is because, as you might have heard Deputy Secretary Hicks say on Monday, we are about trying to have the capability we need to deter our adversaries, including the PRC, in the 20s, but also in the 30s and into the 40s. So the here and now is the procurement focus, and we are happy that the procurement budget is the highest ever because that's really about getting that capability out there and into the hands of our warfighters faster. But we continue the R&D focus because we're not done, the job's not done in 2027 or 2028. So we have a healthy S&T budget as well, continuing to invest in AI. We see a nuclear triad, full funding, of course, for that. That is our bedrock. And one of the challenges all along, a challenge that was seen coming years ago, a challenge that is still here today, right, is to get that once-in-a-generation hump of funding for the triad funded without gutting other things. And so that's one of the reasons that you see the top line increasing, I think, is that we have, I think, broad consensus that we want to modernize the triad without doing it at the expense of everything else. We also, I think, are moving to a better place on Joint Strike Fighters. We're up over 80 this year with 83. Continuing kind of at the same level on tankers, on destroyers, submarines, moving on to the second Columbia. Largest space budget ever. As always, I struggle a little bit with how to describe our space budget because there's so much of it that is classified, but we have progress on a number of fronts there. So across the board, I think we have a good story to tell on the modernization side. I also just want to mention on the next slide, again, things on the theme of things that we cared about before, we care about still. Healthy S&T budget, the same critical technologies that we focused on last year, semiconductors first and foremost, both in our minds and financially, but also batteries, critical materials, energetics, all the things that were in there last year, we carry forward this year. JADC2, although not a giant number, Joint All-Domain Command and Control, is a big organizing principle for the Deputy Secretary and the Vice Chairman as they lead our efforts of how it's great to have the capability on the platform, great to have the capability of a missile, but you have to connect everybody, right? The sensor, the shooter, the decision maker. And so getting there faster on that is an important part of the thought process, even if it's not the biggest program that we have. Rapid defense experimentation is, again, something that the deputy is focused on to try and up our game on joint experimentation so that the components can work together and we can bring the lessons forward in faster turn than we were used to doing. Last thing I'll mention, because I think we're sort of to the point I wanted to go to Q&A, is munitions. Well, actually, second to last thing I want to mention. Munitions, as I said, we are moving to up our game here. We have for decades, as most of you know, done multi-year procurement for platforms like aircraft, ships, helicopters. We are moving into the missile and munitions space, into the missile space for the first time. We want to see how that goes. We're building off of the authorities we got from last year's Congress authorization bill they authorized in advance 17 multi-years. We've picked 4 or 5 of them that are very important to us. As you can look at the list here, they are not Ukraine ground-centric munitions, they are Indo-Pacific-centric munitions. So this speaks to the fact that we are not taking our eye off the ball in this strategy, despite the amount of effort and time that the Secretary and the Chairman and others spend on Ukraine, that all of us do, that the focus is still where the focus was and should be. So we are going to try and provide more stability in sort of a 2-step process, right? We want to go to max capacity on missiles like these, but if the max capacity isn't all that it should be, then we want to do what we can to expand capacity and then come back for more if we can get the capacity expanded. But one place to start is, again, with kind of the stability to industry that a multi-year represents, trying that out on munitions space for the first time. We've also are working on the industrial base in other areas, by the way, like submarines. Last thing I want to mention then, of course, is it's not all about the programs or the platforms or the weapons. The Secretary remains very focused on taking care of our people. As I think you probably heard, we have a 5.2% pay raise in this budget, informed by the private sector wage increases last year, which is what the formulas in law tell us to do. That is what drives it in law, and that's what we've done. We followed the law here. So that's the largest military raise in 20 years, the largest civilian raise in 40 years. We also have some other things to make moving easier for families. We have a continuing commitment to make sure that commissary prices are below prices outside the gate, to go to universal pre-K at our DoDEA schools, to try and incentivize more people to work at our child care centers. So we have a number of areas to try and take care of our people, more so than I'm going to be able to list here. But I just want to close by saying that although I mentioned it last, it is not last to the Secretary, and as probably many of you know, a significant part of our budget is consumed by the pay and benefits of our people. We compete for talent. Of course, we decided as a nation a long time ago, 5 decades ago, to move away from the draft, and so the all-volunteer force is a recruited force. We spend over $100,000 a person on a workforce, 2/3 of whom are under 30. In terms of their pay and benefits. So we have significant amount of money invested in our people, which are the people, and that's what makes us the best. So that's not a complaint that we spend that much money, but it is a fact. And I just want to close with sort of touching on that as well. So with that, let me do some respond to questions.
I will start with a question. It's good to see you, Mike. And this is just kind of trying to get the strategic backdrop. So when I went through the budget that was released this week, I noticed we continued the trend of RDT&E being a larger percentage of the modernization accounts than it was a decade ago. It's about 10% growth. Mm-hmm. So we're spending a lot more on RDT&E compared to procurement. Could you go into some of the rationale behind some of those discussions, or is it just the whole innovation mantra is driving us there?
Yeah, I think there's a mindset that we need to get to a better place on some of the programs, that the technology of today, I'm not picking on this, but I will pick it. An Arrow on the air-to-missile side is not as good as we want something that does more. So 5th generation, obviously very important aircraft, but 6th generation's out there. So I think that partly is just that we feel that there's progress to be made on a number of these fronts. In addition, I think you would probably know better than I, Al, in a way, as a veteran of the old AAT&L, but if there might be a virtue of the split, and I'm not the one to say there, but having an Undersecretary of R&E with her list of 14 critical technologies, I think helps inform, okay, are we paying enough attention on AI? Are we paying enough attention on quantum? I don't necessarily that all those 14 are big drivers of the number. I have said to people, at least in my own view, that our budget could almost be called development and research, not research and development. Most of the money still resides in developing things, not in the most basic research. But I think it is recognizing that the Secretary's phrase for it is, it's not meant to sound fatalistic, but that the PRC's challenge to us is a now and forever challenge, meaning it's not going to be going away when something happens or doesn't happen in the Taiwan Straits in 2027 or 2035 or some other year. We have to think longer than that, and so I think that's kind of what informs the R&D focus.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. John Angeloni, quick question for you, sir, in terms of, have you been able to use our Pentagon budget as a comptroller to influence our NATO and non-NATO allies to adjust their budget to help develop those targeted capabilities that can complement our efforts, particularly as we start looking at the budget decline in the out years, if that were to happen?
Mm-hmm. I am going to say that I would absolutely claim zero credit as for myself that I have done anything to move the needle with the allies. I think one of my colleagues, Undersecretary Colin Call from Policy, has described, at least in conversations inside the building, the Russian invasion, or second invasion, if you want to call it that, of Ukraine as Europe's 9/11. Not necessarily seen that way, maybe equally by all countries. More so on the eastern flank, of course, and those folks already knew very well what the Russians were. But I think that has obviously, in the case of Germany, sparked a proposal which we want to see actually delivered on, right, to increase their spending. So I think that I almost might give Vladimir Putin more credit than myself, but also Bill LaPlante in particular. Bill spends, because of Ukraine, is either over there in Europe or doing virtual meetings from back here on a very routine basis now on the specific subject of, okay, Ukraine's list of things they would like to have is this, who can do this one, who can do that one, you know, that kind of coordination. But it's leading to, you know, broader conversations about our industrial bases, and we recognize very well that there's specific to Ukraine in particular, there's a demand signal being placed on an already stressed industrial base of, you know, trying to get past supply chain issues and trying to get the skilled workers, and now you inject this demand signal on top that it is a problem we should be looking at together. So I think it's the security challenges and the work that the Secretary is doing with his so-called Ukraine Defense Contact Group of about 50 nations that are, you know, huddling again, and again, I think he's doing one of these this week, much like Bill. He obviously the Secretary at a higher level is alternating in person with virtual meetings to try and get people to contribute, to pledge and then to fulfill their pledges and to coordinate on the Ukraine specific front. I think the lessons from that are planting the seeds maybe of more cooperation and NATO and other countries, and Japan, of course, also increasing their defense commitments. But I don't know that it's per se our leadership on the budget. I think it's our leadership more at the Secretary's level and the President's level of leading the coalition on defense spending, on sanctions, on export controls, on the number of areas, humanitarian assistance, where NATO partners and we in particular are working together across a bunch of fronts on Russia. And I think that's sort of creating a good behavior feedback loop.
Great. Thank you, sir. Thanks for being here. Lauren Fish with Elbury Harris. As you pointed out, there's many areas where this budget request aligns to the needs in the Indo-Pacific, but the one theme I didn't see a lot of, at least yet, in the materials was contested logistics, which many of the service leadership have called the pacing challenge, the pacing scenario, the theater. What should we be looking for in the budget capacity when we want to look at those specific things outside of pre-positioned stocks, which we know are just targets for the Chinese? And should we see more of that in 25, if not in this budget?
Yeah, that's a great question and a little bit harder for me to answer. I would say, starting with the most visible, I think people might point to, well, we're continuing the KC-46 program. But when you get into more of the nuts and bolts, you quickly get into things that are harder to pin the tail on it in the budget, right? Of the fuel dispersal that was sort of informed by the Red Hill spill in Hawaii, that we've now looked at, okay, this is probably an outmoded way of doing business anyway, so we started to move out on that. We are dispersing. The Air Force this has been a bit of a long process, right? All of the agreements and environmental setup that you need to do to disperse and build new places to park aircraft either temporarily or longer across the Pacific. I'm sure you saw the Secretary's recent trip where new agreements with Japan, new agreements with the Philippines. But then to actually follow through and do the planning and design and build the facilities at whatever level of austerity or robustness that we decide to do. The Marines have their own concepts in this whole space, but it's I think unfortunately it's a little bit of a bunch of little things that is hard to bring together. The Joint Staff, I know, when they talk about sort of the 4 key aspects of joint warfighting, congested logistics is one of them. So it's not that it doesn't have a focus, but it's not such an easy story to tell in pointing at our budget. And I'll have to sort of take back and talk to my colleagues about if there's a way we could tell that story better than I'm able to right this moment.
Sure. Going back to the FY23 omnibus, appropriated $1 billion for revised
Yeah, thank you for that. We have a plan, and the most important person in that plan is standing right there, the Secretary of the Navy. The Navy in particular had its act together with a lot of specific places where that inflation adjustment could be placed. And so what we did was to try to make sure that we finalized the concept before we locked the budget, right as we were locking the budget, so that the Navy and other services could be informed by, okay, if I need to make a move on a particular ship, are we going to address it here or address it there, or do I have to address it there? You haven't seen the plan yet, just because as we sort of got into the budget crunch and some of the wording needed to be taken back to the shop and polished up across the department. I think the same people that do that do roll out, and they've been a little tied up for the last 10 days or so. But a plan is ready, and it should be leaving my office soon to go to the Hill for the required 30-day review period. So we do have a concept in place. It just kind of got run over a little bit by budget rollout, and needs just a couple of T's crossed, and then we're going to be sending that out for the Hill's consideration.
So we're about out of time. Secretary Del Toro is here. Secretary McCord has agreed to meet with the press. Wherever you're meeting with the press, somewhere in the back there. So I'm sorry, we're just at that time in the schedule.
All right, thank you.